deconstructed these walls and I found
Welcome to the Deconstructionists podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and welcome to part 2 of my interview with Dr. Benjamin Laird, where we discuss his brand new book, Creating the Canon, Composition, Controversy, and the Authority of the New Testament. As always, if you've enjoyed the music that you've heard on the podcast, it's from our good friend, the talented Clay Kirchenbauer, who, terrible gambler, but very talented musician, who releases music under the name Forrest Clay. You can find the songs that you've heard here, as well as others, anywhere you find your music. Getting back to Dr. Laird, he received his PhD from the University of Aberdeen and is the Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity at Liberty University. He's written a number of books on the New Testament, including 40 Questions about the Apostle Paul and 5 Views on the New Testament Canon. So without further ado, here is part 2 with Benjamin freaking Laird.
Go feed the sick and poor and try to help the world to recover.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that you bring up in the book, too, that I thought was fascinating, and it sort of kind of helps solve the mystery of some of the instances where you have disciples or apostles, for example, who were sort of known as being illiterate. And yet, so how did they write, this work? And you talk about the role of secretaries and even perhaps schools who sort of followed a particular apostle and their kind of school of thought. So what role did that play in terms of the actual writing down of some of these accounts?
Secretaries played a very important role. I would just kind of preface that by stating that we don't need secretaries to kind of make this all possible and kind of save the reputation of the canon, right? Not that you're doing that, but there is just this viewpoint out there that these folks in Galilee were just they're illiterate, they're uneducated, they're unsophisticated, and how could they have written anything? Bart Ehrman in his introduction, I think it is, he states in there that someone like Peter, some of these apostles, they couldn't have composed a paragraph in Greek if their life depended on it. I think is his language there, right? And I think that's very much overstated, actually. A lot of scholarship, especially in the last 20, 30 years, is showing that up in Galilee, they were actually exposed to Greek culture much more than we realized before. And, you can go to somewhere like Sepphoris, and you can see Greek inscriptions around, and you have the Decapolis off to the east, you have Greek-speaking areas up to the northwest area. So there were a lot of Greeks who came, or Greek-speaking people who came through there. There's foreign trade routes that go through Galilee. Matthew worked as a tax collector on one of them. So they would have been exposed to Greek. And it's not as though they're just up in the hills and they're only speaking Aramaic and never heard a word of Greek in their life. So I think they were actually much more familiar with it than we might suspect. And then when we go to writings like James, in one of my classes right now, we're working on the Greek text of James. You see a lot of very unique Greek vocabulary there. James in the first chapter, he's using all these rare terms to describe the choppy winds and the waves and even the flowers, that kind of thing in the field. So this is somebody who could actually, a brother of Jesus who grew up in Galilee. He actually had no problem expressing himself in the Greek language. But a resource you might want to, your readers may want to, or your listeners, I should say, may want to look into, Martin Hengel's work. He has a work on Palestine and the Hellenization of it, and it's just very much a surprise to a lot of people that it was actually, the land was much more Hellenized than we might think, and Greek was actually much more prevalent than we often realize. So I don't think that we need to assume that the secretaries were just kind of the apostles are speaking Aramaic and they just compose these Greek works for them. And because the authors could never have done this, but it was actually a very common practice to dictate a text to a scribe. And we have, different Romans in the first century. And even before that, we know who did this, people like Cicero, right? And Seneca, contemporary of Paul. So these individuals would often dictate their letters, their personal correspondence, even something that we might call an epistle today, which is more formal communication to a larger group. All these writings were often dictated to scribes. And so that actually, I think, helps us out quite a bit, especially when it comes to Paul's writings, because one of the common tasks of the secretary wasn't just to compose something, but they would often keep duplicate copies, which I mentioned in the book. So someone like the Apostle Paul is going to actually have a large collection of these duplicates that he had collected over the years of all of his writings. So when Paul's writings are finally, when they're finally edited and begin to circulate, it didn't take someone going all over the Mediterranean world looking for these things, discovering these lost letters of Paul and kind of forming them over many decades. I think Paul would have actually had them, or at least his associates, those who traveled with Paul, likely had these duplicates in their possession. And so that formed an initial collection then. So it's actually a pretty natural process, but secretaries helps us to understand a few of the kind of literary issues as far as the composition goes. But in addition to that, it helps us to understand historically then just how these writings may have come together in the early early history of this.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is really interesting too is we talked a little bit earlier about touched on the Gospels a little bit. And how we ended up with 4, not 5, not 3, but we ended up with 4. And what's interesting to me, and what's always been interesting, is sort of this debate in terms of when each one was composed. A lot of scholars argue, Mark was obviously the earliest, and then Luke and Matthew sort of pull from Mark, or at least pull from some sort of document, perhaps, that contained some of the popular sayings of Jesus. I think they call it document Q or something like that. And then you've got John, who most folks say probably composed last, and it's definitely the most poetic and different of the 4. So in your research, how did these 4 sort of come to be? How did we settle on 4? And why is John so different than the rest?
Well, yeah, the last question is probably the easier question there. So today and in the early church, the vast majority of people did in fact believe that John was the last gospel written. So there's dispute even today about when John was written. The kind of traditional viewpoint is that he wrote near the end of his life. So that would be maybe the 80s or so, maybe even early 90s of the first century. But there are some who continue to hold that John may have written before 70 AD. That is before the temple was destroyed. So there was a work written, I think, in the last year or two, Jonathan Benier, and he's going to argue that a lot of the books in the New Testament were written earlier than the traditional consensus maybe. So there's ongoing dispute about the exact year that John wrote, but most would still agree that he's probably the last of the 4 to write. And it seems that he was writing to supplement the Gospels. And we find language like that in the early church, that we have 3 very parallel accounts about the life of Jesus and his teaching. But then John writes, one of the early church fathers tells us he wrote a spiritual gospel, right? So he's going to write not so much a straight historical account, at least that's how they describe it. And actually, I think it's almost as historical or just as historical as the other 3, because you have all these references to Jesus going to these feasts and very specific language there. Historical accounts, it is a historical narrative, but there is a heavy emphasis on the theology of who Jesus is, right? The nature of Jesus with the prologue and other aspects of that. But John seems to be writing to kind of supplement what's in the first 3. And so that's why a vast majority of John's gospel you won't find repeated in the first 3 gospels. So that's a key there. But as far as why the early church recognized these 4, it has to go back to, as I said a moment ago, to apostolic authority. They recognize that it's these 4 writings. It is these 4 writings that could actually be traced back to that apostolic community. So none of the 4, which it may come as a surprise to us, none of the 4 actually have the names of the apostles attached to them. They're all actually anonymous. But what's interesting is that in the early church, there wasn't any considerable debate about who the authors were. So they're not questioning, who wrote Mark's gospel. They firmly believed it was Mark, and they firmly believed that Luke wrote these. Even though Mark and Luke were relatively obscure figures, there was a widespread consensus on them. So there's no dispute in the early Christianity about who wrote them. It was widely understood. It was Matthew and John, who were of the 12. Mark, as I said a minute ago, who was an interpreter, is the term they like to use in the early church, an interpreter of Peter. So he's just simply recording the eyewitness testimony and recollections of Peter. And then Luke, who's writing on the basis of many eyewitnesses. Eyewitness testimony formed his writing then. But Luke is a very close associate of Paul. Mark, very close associate of both Peter and Paul. So they all are very much connected to that apostolic community in the first century. And then all those other gospels that you may hear about, the early church was convinced they could not actually they did not actually derive from a member of the apostolic community. Even though their name may have suggested that, they would argue that these are later works that were written by unknown figures much later. And they had various arguments for that. Sometimes it was just historical argument based on chronology, and nobody knew about this work until 130, for example. And so by definition, it couldn't go back to the apostles. Or maybe there was a certain teaching about Christ that was considered problematic or at variance with the apostolic community. So they would, of course, write that off as being outside the apostolic community then, and therefore not authoritative. So very quickly, just on historical grounds, they recognize that these 4 books are the only 4 books that could actually be traced back to the apostles. And so for that reason, that we have a very quick consensus on which 4 should be recognized. If John's gospel goes to the end of the 1st century, then we can't have a 4 gospel before that, just by definition. But sometime in the 2nd century is when the 4-fold gospel really comes together. And some would argue it's probably the mid to late 2nd century, around the time of Irenaeus. Irenaeus clearly knew of the 4-fold gospel, but a lot of folks would argue that even today that it was likely in the first half of the 2nd century. So just in the decades after John's gospel was written, perhaps, that the church widely recognized this 4-fold gospel. And then that's interesting because the 4-fold gospel would have actually circulated as one unit. So that's actually helpful for us to understand a little bit about how the canon was formed. We don't have 4 individual works that are floating around, and one person had John, one had Mark. We have some of that, but what we find most of the time is that the 4 circulated together as one unit. So the fact that we have collections of the 4 gospels shows that there was a very close association of these gospels to one another in the early church.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you make of, like, in your research, what do you make of this presence of some sort of disagreements within even the Gospels? So, like, for example, like, the fate of Judas or the birthplace of Jesus. And it, again, if we're going back to, the fact that these were derived from first person, accounts or people that would have traveled with Jesus, like, you would think that they would all have the same story when it comes to some of those details. But, we see instances where they don't.
Yeah, actually, that's a really, that could be a whole other podcast right there, looking at, all the so-called discrepancies in the Gospels and things like that. At times, I think it just comes from simply not comparing accounts carefully and recognizing that they're trying to emphasize different things. Sometimes, we do that whether it's a historical issue or a theological issue. So, for example, James 2 and Paul's writings, Ephesians 2 especially. Sometimes people will get tripped up and say, well, James is emphasizing works and Paul is denying the importance of works and elevating faith over works. And so we have a contradiction. And, I'm not so sure that's the case based on how they use these words and what they're arguing against and what their argument was. So at times we just have to look at what the authors were actually suggesting or emphasizing. And then when it comes to historical issues, sometimes I think we're almost looking for contradictions. And I think sometimes we don't, I think we overstate these apparent contradictions. And we can have differences in detail without there being a contradiction. So, for example, if you have one gospel that mentions 2 angels at the tomb and one mentions 1 angel, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a contradiction. One got it right and one got it wrong. Or, one had bad eyesight or something, or just had, bad note-taking skills or whatever it is. It could just be what their focus is. So one is focusing on maybe 1 angel, the other is focusing on 2, and that may be all there is to it. So it does take a bit of detective work, but also, think about this way. I often mention this to students. If you were trying to come up with 4 gospels that were in complete agreement with each other, you would really compare notes and make sure there's not any discrepancies. So the fact that we do have differences in detail shows me that, they are writing from their eyewitness perspective, and there's not this collaboration between them to try to get all the facts just exactly right, or I should say consistent with each other. Of course, they want to get it right, but this effort to get this, just a very unified presentation of Jesus. So we don't see that there's that effort. They're just simply stating their viewpoints independently, right? And bearing voice to that eyewitness testimony. So I think that actually speaks to their reliability in a different kind of way. Sometimes we don't think of it that way. But we don't see this, again, this effort to just provide this one consistent word. We have 4 viewpoints. I think they're actually consistent with each other, but we have 4 unique voices and portraits of Jesus. Also reminds me of the way they describe the Gospels, right? I mean, if you were trying to describe the Gospels as these great heroes and kind of deify them or something, you wouldn't say all these negative things that you say about the 12 apostles, especially people like Peter, right? But they're just it's almost like they're raw, they're unashamed of, they're just the facts only kind of thing. They just present the truth the way they see it. And there's not this effort to kind of clean up a mess. They just state the facts as they are. And so that actually is reassuring to me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting component to it. You probably wouldn't paint yourself in such a negative light in certain instances. Like, yeah, and that's the time that we fell asleep, and Jesus was like, "Come on, guys, like, get it together." Like, you might omit that if you had the the artistic freedom.
Yeah, or if this is a writing that comes later, multiple generations after the apostles, and you were trying to elevate the importance of, say, the Bishop of Rome or Peter or some. Why would you refer to him as, you have little faith, right. That type of thing. So that you wouldn't have language like that. So that shows just their primitive nature, I think, and their reliability as well. So they are just simply, again, stating what they believed to be the truth and just giving a very clear picture of the events as they recalled them.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the fact that the Catholic version of the New Testament includes some additional writings. Is there any sense from your research where the two took different paths in terms of what they considered part of, Scripture?
Yeah, well, with Catholicism, the main difference then would be what we call the Apocrypha, right? We will often refer to the Apocrypha. And when we say that, we're really referring to books before the New Testament era. So that would be Jewish writings written between the close of the Old Testament and then the ministry of Jesus. So, works like 1st and 2nd Maccabees or Sirach or, something like, or Tobit, there's a wide number of writings there that are considered apocryphal works. So the church, the Catholic Church has recognized these writings traditionally. And that, when I say traditionally, it really goes back officially to the 1500s, which is actually much later than people think. But for, half a millennium then, or half a millennium, there has been recognition of these apocryphal works. But as far as the New Testament goes, there's a consensus in the 27. So even within, between Catholics, Protestants, there's agreement that, we have the same Gospels, same writings of Paul. So there's really no dispute there, even though we have differences of opinion about the Old Testament canon, because the Apocrypha would actually go under that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'll be honest, I was ignorant to that fact until probably a few years ago, and a friend of mine gave me a Catholic version of the Bible. Oh, there's some extra content in here that I wasn't aware of.
There's quite a few extra books. Yeah, definitely. And many of them are, very, very important. The first Maccabees, for example, well, all these works with Maccabees, first, second Maccabees, there's actually 4, but the first 2 especially, and really the first one, it's just very important historically. As far as, literary genre, it looks a whole lot like Acts. We have a lot of narratives, historical accounts. So, we often refer to the period between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry as the silent years, right? You'll often hear people refer to it that way. But there was a lot of very important history going on during that period. And First Maccabees, along with, I would say, Josephus, who comes much later. But First Maccabees is just incredibly important for helping us understand some of the things the Jewish people were going through in those 400 years, roughly, between the close of the Old Testament and then the start of the New. So they're very important works. We shouldn't shy away from them and, kind of treat them as toxic or, something like that. But they make quite a contribution to our understanding of that period for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the other things I thought was a fascinating point that you make in the book is you talk about the evolution of the early church, and in terms of sort of the surviving apostles and how, as the church grew, it became more important, and almost necessary for them to commit things to writing because they just couldn't be everywhere. The church is growing geographically, and they just couldn't travel everywhere. And as more of the apostles, the original eyewitnesses, die off, like even more important to commit your memories to writing.
Exactly, yeah. And what may come as a surprise is that the New Testament writings, well, particularly, it's not really the case with the Gospels and Acts, but the writings of Paul in particular, and even some of the other epistles, later epistles in the New Testament, they were written because the apostles couldn't be at certain places at certain times. That was really the reason. They always preferred direct personal instruction. Polycarp, for example, he writes in the 2nd century, and he writes to the church in Philippi, where Paul had spent a number of days ministering, and he writes an epistle to them, of course. But Polycarp writes to them, and he says, when he was with you in person, he instructed you, and when he was absent, he wrote you letters. And that actually helps us quite a bit, because it reminds us of the fact that the apostles, especially Paul, he would have loved to have been with each of those groups had he had the opportunity, and that was actually his preference. So writing was always just considered a necessary substitute. It was never the preferred means of communication. And we may think of that as kind of the opposite. I mean, you can write something out better by, you can definitely communicate things, I would say, much more articulately on paper than maybe in person, but they didn't see it that way. They actually saw personal instruction as much more important. That's why if you read throughout Paul's writings, he's constantly referring to the fact that he wants to come and visit them and how he longed to be with them again. And he might close the writing by stating, if the Lord wills, I will be with you shortly, and that type of thing. So that's very, very common in his writing. So yeah, it was just a substitute. Writings were just a substitute for personal presence. And then a second thing, and it kind of sounds almost humorous in a way, but oftentimes it was the sin of a community or their lack of knowledge that would lead to Paul writing a letter. So, if the Corinthians had their act together, and everything was going perfectly according to plan, they understood all these doctrines fully, they were in harmony with each other, there was unity, and there wasn't any kind of infighting or any kind of acceptance of sinful practices or behaviors, then why would Paul have to write 1 Corinthians, right? So there's an immediate concern for him that would have prompted, or there may have been many concerns that prompted him to write something. And so it was a lack of convenience. It was the fact that he couldn't be somewhere at a time. Maybe he was imprisoned or just off in another region ministering. He couldn't travel at that moment. That led him to write. And then he's going to address, oftentimes many issues, blunders, and, mistakes that were going on in these churches. So, but we're all, we're definitely blessed for it. It's our gain that Paul was often inconvenienced, and the churches. I often think, how much would we know about the resurrection or the doctrine of the Lord's Supper or some of these things if the Corinthians didn't need instruction on these things? So we actually receive Paul's own personal instruction on these doctrines and these practices just because the church in Corinth needed correction and needed extra guidance. So, yeah, it was often just the fact that writings were substitutes. That's why we have them in our New Testament today. So wonder what it would be like today, right? Today, we wouldn't have that issue quite as much, but in the first century, it was often much more difficult to communicate.
Yeah, we'd have a series of YouTube videos,
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder. The history nerd in me says, "Oh gosh, like what other things might we have learned if more of these firsthand witnesses had put a pen to paper and or whatever, and had left behind more of their thoughts on what they were experiencing? Because obviously Paul is easily probably the most prolific in terms of his writings, but you don't really see that. There's a lot of disciples and apostles that we don't have anything from them, that we're aware of anyway. And it just kind of makes you wonder, what was going on, what were they preaching and what was their instruction at the time?
Yeah, I mean, primarily their role was to bear witness to the work of Christ, and they served as eyewitnesses to the resurrection, and they went out and taught all things. But remember what we said a minute ago, their primary focus was on personal instruction. That's what they always preferred. So I imagine that all the disciples, all these 12 apostles, were engaged in, teaching in one way or another, whether it was in Jerusalem early on, or, some of them are going to leave many years later or sometime later and take the gospel to these other places. But most of their ministry seemed to have been in person. So there's not that many. Paul was just very unique because he didn't just go to one place and stay put there. he is going to travel extensively. And the longest he was in any place at one time was probably about 10 years. And that was just early on in his Christian life. He spends probably a decade in Tarsus after his conversion. And then he's going to spend some time in other places like Antioch before he starts to really travel and kind of bounce around from one place to the next. So I would say his life, the course of his life was just a little bit different than the other apostles, but he would have also been gifted in different ways. So we shouldn't expect that all 12 of the apostles were just very gifted in the act of writing. I mean, they all would have had, just like today, we all have different personalities and backgrounds and skills, and God has called us to do all different things, right? And use our background and our abilities for his purposes. And so I don't think it was, and I could be wrong, but I doubt that every single one of the apostles was, incredibly gifted in the art of writing and or that they even sought to write. I think many of them were probably more focused on one local area, and it was oral instruction. That was primarily their work. So it's a minority of the apostles that actually write. So when you look at the big picture of the New Testament, you only have 4 of the 12. Well, if I include Paul and add the number 1 there to make it 13, we only have 4 direct apostles, right, that are writing the New Testament writings. Then we have 4 that are written by colleagues of the apostles, for 8 altogether. So only about a third then of those individuals named apostles were actually writing text, at least texts that have been preserved for us. As you said, there may have been some that are not preserved for us, but a small percentage, relatively small percentage then of the apostles actually had an ongoing writing ministry, and some more than others, right? So the Apostle Paul writing, there's actually 13 works that have his name on it in the New Testament, but others, we have Matthew with 1 gospel, and John writes quite a bit, of course, but outside of those, we don't have too many writings of the apostles then.
Yeah, and you just mentioned, sort of the ongoing debate amongst some of the writings that were attributed primarily to Paul, just kind of this ongoing debate over whether or not he wrote certain things. So, at the end of the book, you ask the question, so where does the New Testament really derive its authority from? And so, especially in the light of today and the ongoing scholarship and some of the document findings and more of the research we've done over the years, how do we maintain authority on all of the books that were included? And what does that look like for the modern day Christian?
Yeah, very good. And sometimes I think we view this maybe from a we think theologically we kind of weed out the history. And I don't think we need to kind of separate the two. I think they actually go hand in hand. But as I said at the very beginning of our time together, the apostles are unique because they were directly commissioned by Christ. And so the authority of the apostles didn't come from the fact that they were just the most gifted people in the first century, even the most spiritual, the most righteous. They didn't have the greatest intellectual gifts. They weren't from the upper classes. I mean, just from a human perspective, there wasn't anything that we would say, okay, these 12 guys, they should be the authoritative figures. And there's just something different about their nature, right? But their authority comes from their relationship to Jesus. That's why they had authority, because Christ directly commissioned them. It'd be no different than if, an ambassador shows up. There's an American ambassador to France or something, right? And I'm over in Europe on vacation. I'm walking the streets of Paris, and the two of us go, to maybe a government building, and they're going to pay much more attention to him, the ambassador of the U.S. The White House sent him, and he actually represents the White House. They're not going to pay any attention to me. They're not going to give me the time of day. They'll just tell me to go off somewhere else. Even though we're both American citizens, and I could say, well, I'm actually just as qualified as this guy here. There's no difference between us. We're both Americans, but the other represented the government. And so similarly, we have the apostles. They actually represented Christ, which is something if you can go look at, for example, First Clement chapter 42, that's an emphasis there is God sent Jesus. You can see this whole train of thought in his mind. God sent Jesus, and then Jesus sent out the 12. And so there's this direct link then to Jesus through the apostles. That's where their authority was. So their teaching was authoritative, not because they were just the intellectual giants of the first century, or because they wrote the best works, and they were like the Mark Twain of the first century, and just all their works were classics, that kind of thing, or whoever your favorite author is. But their works were regarded as authoritative because of that relationship. And so the question for us is, well, if these works have a close relationship to Jesus, well, then we can accept them and recognize them as authoritative. So that's why these historical issues are actually very important. The church wrestled with the fact whether or not a work actually could derive from an apostle, if it was authentic. For example, 2 Peter, does it actually go back to Peter? If so, how does it? What's the connection there? So they were deeply interested in those issues, because if you can point a work to the apostolic community, then you can actually go back to Christ. So there was that chain there, as we mentioned. So that's something I emphasize in the book is the importance of apostolic authority. I think it's something we often miss today, or I think we often diminish its importance, dismiss its importance. And I think part of the reason why is because it's part of the effect of critical scholarship over the last century or two, especially. We're often just bombarded with scholars who argue that works could not have been written by apostles, that we have all these inauthentic, synonymous works in the New Testament, and therefore we think authorship is completely irrelevant. And we just say, well, God in his providence has seen fit to include these writings. So whether or not Peter wrote this, or if it was written in the year 120, it really doesn't matter. The important thing is God wanted us to have it. And so it's just kind of a way of getting around those thorny historical issues, I would say. But that's not how the early church thought of it. They did wrestle with those historical issues and put a lot of weight on apostolic authority. So the book is, as best I can and as simply as I can without being too simplistic, I try to talk about just why apostolic authority is so important and why we might want to start to emphasize that a little bit more than maybe we have in the past.
Yeah, I love that. And there's something that I also love about the fact that, the individuals who sort of passed on these accounts were not, as you said, the Mark Twains. They were the average, human. And maybe, and perhaps that's why they stuck with a facts-based approach that oftentimes doesn't paint all the characters in play in the best light. And there's something that's unique and sort of beautiful about that.
Yeah, exactly. Like we said, they're just very clear. They just state the facts as they are. You don't get the sense that these have been really cleaned up and polished. So the apostles are representatives, but they're not the focal point, right? So there's no attempt to make Peter this, enormous. It's not hagiography, as the church historians might say. They're just representatives. They're just witnesses to the one that it's really all about, right? I mean, even so much so that they don't even put their own names on them, right? And the Apostle Paul, I should say, the Apostle John, he doesn't even mention his own name. He's just the apostle that Jesus loved. That's all he is, right? And Matthew and Mark and Luke, they don't even refer to themselves by name. At times they're in the text, but they don't draw attention to themselves as even the authors at all. So that shows us the focal point was never on these men. It was about Jesus all the way throughout.
Yeah, I love that. I love that fact. So before we go, absolutely brilliant book. I absolutely recommend it to everybody. Creating the Canon, Composition, Controversy, and the Authority of the New Testament. Go check it out. What is your hope for this book? What is kind of the hope for the lasting impression for the reader?
Well, I think maybe a couple things. I hope that it clears up some confusion about maybe some of the misperceptions people have about the canon formation. So I hope that it serves as a very clear and accessible guide just to some of those key questions that we have about how the canon came together. So I try to just lay out all the evidence without going, too deep into things. It provides a sufficient amount of detail, I would say, without becoming just, too much, right? So I hope that it's accessible work, and I believe that will, give us a broad picture of how the canon was formed from not just, in the 2nd or 3rd century, but starting with composition, how the writings would have actually been produced and composed, and then later formed into a particular canon, how the writings would have actually been collected later on, and then, why are they authoritative for us today? So I'm trying to give people a big picture of all that, looking at those different phases of canonicity. But in addition to that, I would say I hope it just stirs up a lot of discussion on canon, right? So I raise to treat a lot of subjects that I think really need more attention and maybe have been overlooked or misunderstood. So I'm just hoping that the book will actually, prompt some fresh discussion that will be and that'll be the case hopefully among scholars, but also among lay people in churches, in Bible studies, things like that. People can begin to have some fresh conversations about, this work of writings that have come down to us over the many centuries.
Yeah, I think I think you absolutely accomplished that. I think it's very accessible and easy to break down some very, complicated aspects of the formation of, this text that a lot of us have spent our lives reading. So I think you've done an excellent job. So I very much appreciate you coming on to talk about it and spending some of your day with me.
Oh, been my pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation.
All right. Thanks so much.
No church, tell me what made us think that we could keep others away in the name of some so-called safety. 'Cause we sold our souls for a little bit of power and control, and we left a hole, and those we're called to love. Oh, church, what have we done? No church, when will we ever see? Until we're all treated the same, that nobody is actually free. Oh, church, started to pave the way to our irrelevancy, 'cause we've driven the other away. 'Cause we sold our soul for a little bit of power and control, and we left a hole, and those we're called to love, I guess they're not enough. Oh, church, what have we done? But there is hope, somewhere to go, someone to feed, someone to lead, someone to clothe. And who are we, if not redeemed, bringers of peace and justice, sweet and holy love? Oh, church, what have we done? No, church, what have we done? May we sell our souls to be rid of all the power and control. May we lose ourselves for those we're called to love. Oh, church, let that be us.